My name is Miyako Yerrick. I'm the administrator for the Columbia University DC Club. Thank you everyone for joining us. We are going to get started. So tonight we have the Brain and Pain Breakthroughs in Neuroscience with Dr. Richard Ambron. And he'll be in conversation with Dr. Francis Onyimba. And we wanted to mention that today is co-sponsored with the MIT Club of Washington, DC. So welcome to members from both of our schools tonight. Quick intro, Professor Ambron is a Professor Emeritus of Pathology, Anatomy, and Cell Biology at the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University. And he has co-directed the clinical anatomy course for first-year medical and dental students. And we do want to just mention there are much more detailed bios on our website, so please go there and see both of our speakers. Dr. Francis Onyimba is a gastroenterologist at the University of Maryland Medical Center. She completed medical school at Columbia University prior to completing her internal medicine residency and a fellowship in GI motility and neurogastroenterology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And Francis, I am going to just turn it over to you at this point so we can get started.
Okay, thanks Miyako for the introduction. I study and treat patients with esophageal diseases, just to clarify that part of the introduction. It's wonderful to have everyone with us tonight. Professor Ambron, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm personally very excited for this talk because it's applicable to what I do day in and day out. Before we dive into your book, though, I was hoping you can give us a little bit of information about your journey into neuroscience and what fostered your interests, especially in pain.
Well, my journey into neuroscience was really based on trying to develop ways to cause nerve regeneration. The tragedy of spinal cord injuries and the inability of some certain nerves to grow, that was the impetus behind my studies. And I did that for about 20 years. But along the way, we found that there was a molecule that was present after an injury that caused neurons to become hyperexcitable. And hyperexcitability translates into pain. And we were very curious as to what could the nature of this molecule be and where does it fit into the scheme of persistent or chronic pain. And it turns out that this molecule is very different than the ones that we typically associate with pain because its action was delayed. And it's delayed because it is produced at the site of the injury and then is transported back to the cell body, enters the nucleus, and then changes the electrophysiological properties of the cell body. And it makes it more excitable. So there's this long delay that is required for the molecule to be transported back to the cell body. And this is characteristic of many types of chronic pain. And in fact, the hyperexcitability that results from that is also typical of many types of chronic pain. So that got me interested in it, and we pursued the molecular and the cellular biology of this phenomenon. But then I began to think, well, there has to be a lot more to pain than just the fact that there is this particular molecule, which we identified as protein kinase G by Dr. Sung in my lab. There had to be more to pain than just the transport of information from the site of an injury up to the brain. And the focus of my book, therefore, the reason I wrote the book is the feeling that we can't really alleviate chronic pain unless we understand normal pain. And the purpose of writing this book was to explain that the nervous system processes information about pain and to show that pain is not an automatic response to an injury. And I think that that's very important. What we experience as painful, and a key word here is experience, because experience implies knowledge. And that I think is going to be important for later discussion. But what we experience as being painful is actually determined by interactions between three neuronal systems: a somatosensory system, and that's the one that conveys information from the site of an injury to the thalamus via the spinal cord. There is an afferent system that modulates pain depending on mood or emotions, and then a cognitive system that contributes what we call salience. That is, he makes a determination whether or not pain is going to receive consciousness. So until recently, and I think the first part of my book certainly emphasized this, most efforts to alleviate pain have focused on the somatosensory system. I mean, everybody was studying what's happening in the spinal cord, what's happening at the nerve endings, what are the triggers for pain, et cetera. And this was very valuable because it gave rise to the opiates, which are certainly the foremost way of alleviating chronic pain. Unfortunately, not all kinds of chronic pain. But as we learned more about this affective and these cognitive systems, we could ask a very important question. Is there a center within these systems in the brain that is responsible for the sensation of pain? In other words, is there a pain center? And I have to be truthful, when I started writing this book, I had no idea that such a center actually existed. And much to my surprise, there's a lot of evidence that in fact this does exist. Their imaging studies of the brain in pain have been invaluable. And if you look at people who are in pain, if you look at people who are hypnotized, that where they can modify their pain depending on suggestion, if you look at people who undergo mindfulness training, if you look at people, pain versus attention, all of these things point to a site in the brain known as the anterior cingulate cortex that is both necessary and sufficient for pain to be experienced. Now, if this is correct, and I certainly hope that it is, it would be really remarkable, because then we might be able to control the activity of this circuit pharmacologically by injecting drugs to inhibit the various kinases that give rise to the electrophysical properties. And this would obviate the need for injecting it into the circulatory system. Anytime you inject a drug into the circulatory system, you're going to have side effects. So this could mitigate some of those. We also have these new techniques that are being developed. There's improvements in deep brain stimulation and the very exciting technique, optogenetics, which are enabling scientists to manipulate circuits in specific areas of the brain. So if this is possible, we might be able to eliminate or at least alleviate all kinds of chronic pain, including psychological pain. So the gist of all of this is I think we are entering a new era in pain management. I think it's going to be very exciting, and I'm really very, very hopeful that in the near future we'll be able to deal with this terrible condition. And before we go further, I have to acknowledge my good friend and colleague, Ahmed Sinaf. I mean, the illustrations that he did for this book were invaluable. They certainly made it easy for the reader to understand the concepts. So kudos to Ahmed.
Wonderful. That was a fantastic overview of your book. I want to start out by saying, for those of you at home that are listening, we do have a Q&A box for you to write your questions for Professor Ambron. We have a dedicated time where we'll get through your sessions and he'll have the opportunity to answer them. But as you think of them, feel free to write them down. I wanted to say for your book, the language was very clear. You're somebody who has had over 40 years running a neuroscience lab. And on top of that, you were a course co-director for clinical anatomy, which if you haven't taken that, it's not easy. So you're uniquely positioned to give insights from a neurobiological standpoint, as well as the anatomical standpoint about pain. What I thought was interesting in reading your book was that the language broke it down for people who are, neuroscience enthusiasts, the layperson, and clinicians, PhDs, whoever wants to read and learn about pain. It was kind of easy to do so. For those of us that are here today, could you talk a little bit about the normal pain pathways in a little bit more detail? You talk about first order, second order, third order neurons sending pain signals up. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Sure. Pain begins I'm going to talk about pain of an injury now, because inflammatory pain is more complicated. But when you receive an injury that pierces the skin, there are what called algogenic agents that are released from the damaged tissues. And a mild injury, like a little pinprick, is going to be painful, but it results in the release of ATP, which is one of the most abundant compounds in cells. There is a receptor on the terminal of the first order nociceptive neurons that could bind and recognize as the ATP. When the ATP binds to that receptor, it activates a channel and kinases, and it results in an action potential. And that action potential then is going to propagate from the finger all the way along the nerve into the central nervous system, where it's going to synapse on a second order neuron. And the synapse is very interesting. It's an enlargement of the axon, and it's filled with vesicles. And within those vesicles are the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter for pain is glutamate. Now, the purpose of the action potential is when it reaches the terminal, it opens calcium channels. And calcium is a tremendous messenger for all kinds of activities inside cells. One of the things that it does, it causes the vesicles containing the neurotransmitter to fuse with the membrane and release the neurotransmitter into a cleft. And the cleft is a space between the presynaptic ending and the postsynaptic ending. Well, glutamate now is in the cleft. It has a receptor on the postsynaptic cell. And when it binds to that, it is going to open calcium channels, and it is going to generate, if there's enough glutamate, action potentials that are going to propagate up the spinal cord to third order neurons in the thalamus. So if we stop, okay, if we stop there for a second, I think one question a lot of people ask me, well, why do you need the synapse? Why not just have the first order neuron central process go all the way up to the brain?
Yeah.
And the reason is because that synapse is a site of regulation.
Yeah.
You can control the transmission across that, and that's what happens. That's what the opiates do. They shut down that transmission. So now the first order doesn't communicate with the second. And there are other compounds that do that. Serotonin does it to some extent, GABA. These all act on regulating the transmission between the first order and second order at that synapse. So now we have the pain up in the brain, and it synapses on third order neurons, a collection of third order neurons in the thalamus. And here, from most recent data, is where we first perceive the fact that there is pain. We become aware of it in the thalamus. It's more complicated than that, but let's just take that for now. And then the thalamus is basically a hub, and it sends information to other centers in the brain. Also, it sends information to the postcentral gyrus. And that's where Penfield and Mossinson mapped the homunculus. So in the thalamus, we understand that there is pain, and we have some indication of the intensity of the pain based on how many action potentials there are. And in the thalamus, in the homunculus, we know where in the body the pain is coming from. So that's the purpose of the somatic sensory system. It tells you that you're in pain, and it tells you where the pain is coming from. What happens after that, the other places, those are the affective systems and the cognitive systems that are going to mold the input and give rise ultimately to what is going to be perceived. But what the thalamus sends to those other parts of the brain doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the intensity, because the intensity can be modified by the affective centers and by the cognitive centers. You understand that? You understand how pain gets to the brain.
So let me make sure I have this so I can go home and explain it to my husband, that if he burns his hand, there's going to be a neuron that gets that injury response from his hand or his fingertip. And then it goes all the way up to an area in his spinal cord.
Right.
And then there is a synapse or a stop point for regulation. If we didn't want that to continue, or something happens, a medication it would stop there and wouldn't go up the rest of the way.
Correct.
But then if it were to continue, because there's a chemical or a neurotransmitter there, it then activates this second neuron, and electrical pulses are carried up that neuron to the thalamus, that special part of the brain that's perceiving pain.
Right.
And then the response can then go up a third neuron, which sends it to all these other brain centers, which will bring in these other systems that you talked about, the affective system, the cognitive system, and then determine how you're really perceiving the pain and reacting to it. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary.
Okay.
Now I'm going to throw in a little bit of a puzzle.
Okay.
Something that puzzled me for a long time. If you went back into the 1950s, they used to do what's known as a prefrontal lobotomy on psychiatric patients. And some of these patients developed a peculiar situation known as asymbolia. That is, the awareness of the sensation was dissociated from the sensation itself. So think about this. Here is a patient who severely burned his hand on the stove, looked at it and said, wow, that's really terrible, but I don't care. Okay, so what was happening is the awareness of the pain was emerging from this third order, the circuitry in the thalamus,
Right.
but the painfulness itself was emerging from the centers that are distal, the centers that communicate from the thalamus to the affective system and to the cognitive system. So you can dissociate pain into an awareness of pain and a hurtfulness of pain, and they're
Right.
different.
Right. That makes me think about, and I will, I think, have a role of oversimplifying some concepts which are beautifully explained in the book for those of us who are watching that have zero biology background. But for instance, I see a child on the playground and they have an injury, say someone hits them on the head with a baseball bat, that will hurt anyone and have a very intense pain response. But let's say they fall and skin their knee. And you can see that there is physical injury there. But that child may pause and they look like they're deliberately trying to figure out if they should have pain or not. They might look to a nearby adult for a signal, or they could be easily distracted with a toy and completely forget that they're supposed to be in pain. Part of your book talks about attention. Absolutely. And how that can modulate our pain response. Can you elaborate a little bit more about attention and the interplay with pain, and if you've seen anything about children and the perception of pain, can you just elaborate and why we see that kind of response?
Sure. I mean, let's take a situation similar to what you were just describing. You're walking along the street and you have an awareness, you're conscious of the fact that you exist. Then you hear a dog and your attention shifts to the dog, but then all of a sudden you hear a siren. Now you pay attention to the siren, but then you step on a tack and you hurt your foot. Now you pay attention to the tack. So there is a hierarchy of attention. The brain determines which of these sensations is most important at that particular time. Well, when you heard the dog barking, that was fine. But when you heard a siren, you know from experience that a siren is a much more serious input than the barking of a dog. And then when you hurt your foot, the pain is going to supersede those two because pain is the most important of the sensations. It means you are in danger and something is going to have to be done about it. So yes, there is a hierarchy in which the brain makes a decision as to what attention is going to be paid to which sensation. And one great way to alleviate or mitigate pain is to distract people. For example, why do dentists play music? They want you to pay attention to the music and then you'll forget about what's going on inside your mouth. Post-operative patients, they find that if they put them in a ward with music, it soothes the pain. Belief is a very way of shifting attention. If you believe something strongly, or you believe that you hear something, you read something, you can shift your attention, that will alleviate pain. So you hit on one of the key understandings of modern understandings of pain is that distraction is a key to alleviating pain. And if we can distract people in any means necessary, that is great effect. That has a great effect.
Along those same lines, when we think of attention, distraction, or lack thereof, I think of mindfulness and how kind of meditation and mindfulness and those principles are sometimes used for decreasing pain or anxiety, depression, etc. What have you seen in the body of literature about mindfulness and pain management?
Okay, I mean, mindfulness is a state. It's a state of the mind.
Yeah.
And there are two different levels of mindfulness. There's what they call focus attention. And that is the basic level of mindfulness training. And it's one that you can achieve relatively easy. And what you do is you focus your mind, you train your mind to focus on something like breathing, and focus on that to the exclusion of everything else. Now, that's very, very useful, for example, if you're very anxious, something that you have anxiety. Anxiety, we know, exacerbates pain. So if you can reduce the anxiety level, that's terrific. And if you can do this practice, this focus attention practice, and you are able to focus on your breathing to the exclusion of everything else, at the very least, you're going to reduce your anxiety level. And this works. I mean, brainwave studies have shown, when the waves are in the alpha state, that means the brain is relatively relaxed. And there are a lot of studies that show that focused attention does increase the number of alpha waves. So it is a verification of the fact that focused attention does reduce anxiety. The next level is much more difficult to attain, and that's called open monitoring. And this to me is remarkable because what these practitioners have been able to do is to willfully dismiss a sensation. They use their brain to change the focus of attention. So they're not using an external thing, they're not using breathing, they're not using something external as a distractant. They are willfully saying, I'm not going to pay attention to this, I'm going to pay attention to that. And that to me is really an astounding thing. The brain is controlling the brain. And studies, imaging studies of mindfulness trainers who have this open monitoring presents evidence that this does work. It does work on the cognitive and the affective systems as we would predict to reduce pain. What's interesting is that it does not use opiates. It is an independent system, and there's a little bit of a mystery there as to how it works. But I think one of the things I want the readers to take from this book is mindfulness training is not a hoax. Whatever you read about it and the supernatural and all of these other things, don't believe that. Believe that it does work because the evidence suggests that it does.
That brings two things to mind. I want to write one down so I don't forget it about mindfulness is not a hoax. And then also you mentioned that the effect has nothing to do with opiates. And so in your book, you talk about some of the pharmacological therapies that are out there for chronic pain management. You talk a little bit about the role of opiates and marijuana in the management of chronic pain. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? I have a lot of patients who kind of come to me with questions about marijuana, and then we all have heard extensively about the opioid epidemic currently.
Yes, I mean, the opiates have a number of very undesirable side effects, obviously. Marijuana is really only at the beginning stages of being investigated in this country because for so many years it was illegal. Right. You really couldn't get a grant to study it. But I think that there's over 100 compounds in some of the extracts of marijuana plants. So I think that there are potentially many other drugs that might be discovered. But the CBD oil, which attacks the CB2 receptors, it does not act on the receptors that are responsible for the THC hallucinogenic side effects. So it works in the periphery, and there's some evidence that it works in the central nervous system. It alleviates the inflammatory response, which is a very important source of a lot of different kinds of pain, especially chronic pain. And it does, as I said, it doesn't have the side effects that are associated with the opiates. Much more research is going to be done on this, and I think in the next couple of years, there are probably going to be breakthroughs. We'll know more about exactly how it works at the molecular level. And I think it's very promising. We have to keep our eye on it.
Okay. And do you want to touch on the opiates a little bit? I know the science behind it. We can skip to something else I know it's a behemoth of a topic.
Well, I mean, the opiates control the synapse between the first and second order neuron. And the opiates are produced in a structure known as the periaqueductal gray. So you have neuron cell bodies sitting in the periaqueductal gray. It's in the brain, it's above the spinal cord, and they have axons that come down, and they synapse on the presynaptic terminal of the first order neuron. So when, for example, the best example of this effect is stress-induced analgesia, where soldiers in World War I, World War II received these tremendous injuries and basically ignored the injury, because there was such an overwhelming response to the injury that these periaqueductal gray neurons containing the opiate were activated, and they were released on the presynaptic terminal. And they basically prevented the presynaptic terminal from releasing the glutamate that shuts down the pain. So that goes back to why I said a synapse is important, is at a regulatory site, and it explains perfectly why the opiates are so effective.
Right.
The problem with opiates is that you develop a tolerance to get the same level. And there's also an element to the reward system. There's a center in the brain that they call the nucleus accumbens that seems to have a great influence on whether we consider something to be rewarding. And in terms of pain, you might be willing to bear pain because you have decided that the outcome, winning a prize, winning a trophy, is worth the pain. But that system can also go amok, and it can also tell you, hey, listen, opiates are really great. They give you a high. Why not take them? So they can override the other systems, and that contributes to tolerance, and it contributes to addiction.
So I think when a lot of us hear about opiates, our brain goes to the medications, but in fact, what you're talking about is that they're endogenous opiates where our body naturally makes them, and they are responsible for that stress analgesic response that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point.
Yeah.
The endogenous compounds are actually called opioids.
Yeah.
The exogenous compounds are called opiates. So fentanyl and all the others, they are made by the pharmaceutical industry.
Going back to your point about mindfulness is not a hoax, this is more of a comment than a question quickly. So as a gastroenterologist, I see a lot of patients who have irritable bowel syndrome or functional abdominal pain, and those are areas where we study the brain-gut axis and kind of the communication of the nerves in the enteric nervous system and how that sends messages to the central nervous system, i.e. the brain, and how there's a strong interplay with that signaling and also a role for anxiety, depression, mood disorders to then amplify the pain response. What have you seen, or if you can touch base on kind of the brain-gut axis and the role of pain in these kind of disorders?
Well, the gut is, the inside of the gut essentially is outside the body. So it's like, the same as the skin. It's subject to invasion. It's subject to things that can have an effect. All I know is that the chemoreceptors in the gut can recognize things that are released by bacteria. So that the biome of the bacteria in the gut are very important. I know that the vagus nerve seems to be one of the critical transmitter functions, or transmitting information from the gut to the brain by the parasympathetic nervous system. I know that they're treating vagus nerve for depression. So this whole interplay between the gut biome, the receptors on the various terminals of the enteric neurons, the transmission of information to the vagus, and then the information that goes up to the brain. I think that it's another one of these fields that is warranting tremendous attention, and I think it's very important.
I agree.
I
agree entirely.
Have to attack pain from many as many possible levels as possible.
Yeah, and I love that you talk about the three systems, because I think functional abdominal pain in my field is one of the more challenging diagnoses to manage. You have patients with severe pain, their exam is normal, their studies are normal, but they're having real pain. And we manage a lot of that with medications like tricyclic antidepressants to neuromodulate kind of what's going on a nerve level. And patients sometimes take that to mean that we're saying, it's all in your head, or that you are depressed and that's why you're having it. But so then you beautifully describe the interplay of all of these factors in the perception of pain. So it'd probably be great if all of my patients read the book.
I would certainly be happy.
Yeah, to get a deeper understanding of where their pain is coming from and why it's a multimodal approach to managing that. If you can tell me a little bit about the new technologies that you see on the horizon based on our new understanding of maybe this area in the cingulate cortex that is responsible for our perception of pain.
Okay, I think that this is really a great time to bring all of these things together, because this new technique, optogenetics, is really exciting. And the reason I'm very hopeful that there is this pain center somewhere located within the anterior cingulate cortex means that if we could control the activity of the neurons in that center, we could regulate pain. So how do you control neurons in the brain into it? And optogenetics is an interesting approach. There are proteins called opsins. And opsins are light activated. Whatever their activity is, it's determined by light. And some opsins are channels. So it is possible to take an opsin and, using a viral vector, insert the virus, the opsin, into a nerve cell. Now, if it's a channel, say for sodium, when you shine light on that opsin, laser light at the proper frequency, the sodium channels will open and the cell will fire. There are opsins that open for chloride ions. If you control those, the chloride ion goes in and it prevents the cell from firing. So now, by shining different light sources on those neurons, you can regulate the activity of that neuron. Stimulated, inhibited. Even more exciting is there are opsins that are linked to specific kinases, so that when they're activated, they will activate a particular kinase, and we know what some of the downstream targets for these kinases are. So you can modulate the activity within the neuron using another wavelength of light. So if you could imagine that you put these very fine, finer than a hair, wires into the area where these ops have been inserted, and they use adenoviruses to get them into the cells. When they're expressed, you could be able to control the activity of those neurons in that center. So when pain was coming on, you could zap it with, say, with chloride and shut the excitability down. It's in the future, but listen, Elon Musk is investing hundreds of millions of dollars of inserting electrodes in the brain and controlling place.
Right.
If he's putting that money in, there's got to be something behind it.
Right. So there's already support for optogenetics for pain. Is that what you're saying?
Not for pain yet, because this center now, I think, I hope my book is advertising the possibility that this center exists. Yeah. But it's being used for retinitis pigmentosa. It's being used for, I think, Alzheimer's, I heard. It's being developed for depression. As long as we can find a center in the brain that is responsible for a particular behavior, that can be modified. Now that can be scary,
right?
Because it conjures up ideas about mind control and things like that. But it is
at least mood control.
At least mood control, right? And if it controls pain, then it's a way, as I said, of leading all chronic pain, including, see, psychological pain doesn't exist in the periphery. It's only inside the brain. Bereavement, social ostracism, it activates this circuit, but it doesn't involve the somatosensory system at all. So opiates are not going to deal with that because it has nothing to do with the impulses that are coming from the outside of the body.
Could you talk a little bit, I mean, we're talking about being able to manipulate certain centers of the brain. Can you talk a little bit about deep brain stimulation and what you see on the horizon for that with chronic pain management?
Yeah, deep brain stimulation has come and gone, and it's making a resurgence because the electronics are better. The size of the wires are better. They're much smaller, much more. So the surgery to insert these is much smaller. It certainly has a role, but it's not, I don't think, as refined as optogenetics. It's not going to give you the same level of fine control. Now, I'm not an expert in deep brain stimulation at all. They may be able to overcome some of these problems. Certainly, you don't have to use a virus to insert the opsins, so it has that advantage. But it's going to be the implantation and the electronics and the ability to, the interface between the neurons and the electrodes that are being used. These things are being worked out, and I'm hopeful that deep brain stimulation will also have a role in controlling pain.
Right. I saw, I was trying to look into it a little bit as I was reading through your book. There seemed like there was a very small study in terminal patients with cancer who had deep brain stimulation, and the majority of, I'll say maybe 14 out of 17 had a pretty promising response to the deep brain stimulation and had a lower need for opiates when leaving the hospital, which I guess, again, just points to the fact that there are options, and the ability to identify specific centers or areas within the brain would just further our options for therapeutics, which is exciting to me.
Very well put. Very well. That's exactly correct.
Yeah. I have a question on somewhat of a controversial topic, so you can answer it or pass. And it's really about pain as a vital sign. So you mentioned that there are other factors that determine our perception of pain. Over the past few years within hospitals, pain has become the additional vital sign in addition to heart rate and blood pressure, etc. Based on what we now know, that mood plays a role, whether or not it's coming to consciousness plays a role, and it might not necessarily be a direct correlation to the degree of injury or underlying processes. Do you feel that pain is objective, quantifiable, reliable as a marker of underlying injury or pathology or severity of disease?
Well, I think that taken at face value, a more severe injury is going to result in more severe pain. And you might be able to modulate that depending on your culture, depending on your beliefs. You might be able to modulate it. So yeah, there is a direct correlation between the severity of an injury and the degree of pain. And within certain limits, we can modulate that. Can we modulate the consciousness of pain, the hurtfulness of the pain? And this is where the separation between an awareness of pain and the hurtfulness of pain is important. You're not going to modulate the hurtfulness of pain at the thalamus, especially for psychological pain. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but a lot of forms of chronic pain can originate centrally. I mean, they have nothing to do with the peripheral nervous system. If you have thalamic neurons that start firing, they are going to send that information to the other parts of the brain. And the brain doesn't know where this is coming from. It's just getting a signal from the thalamus. And that kind of pain is basically intractable. I mean, we really can't deal with that. But pain is a vital sign. It's necessary, it's adaptive, and it's informative.
Wonderful. Quick science question for you, and you may have addressed it earlier and perhaps I missed it, but with the potential identification of this cortex, have there been studies where knocking out that area in animal models have clearly affected the pain response?
They have done what they have removed the anterior cingulate cortex in patients, and they developed the same outcome as the lobotomy study. They were aware of pain, but they don't feel it. They don't care about it. So that is one. I mean, surgery, removing a section of the brain is not exactly what you call refined.
Right.
But on the outset, the result is the same as the lobotomy patient, and there is this separation between awareness and hurtfulness. So that is another reason why I think that is a center, an important center for pain.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead. We have several questions. So I'm going to start a little bit early with the Q&A part of this so that we can get to everybody in time and have you give the opportunity for any last thoughts. We have a question that says, have you studied social pain? I believe I suffer from it. At times, I will have strong feelings of rejection and Tylenol will help me.
Okay. This is now, it's under the rubric of psychological pain. It is now accepted by the psychiatric community as being a legitimate source of pain. Rejection, social rejection, is a legitimate source of pain. You may not feel the pain as intensely as you do regular pain, but it is a form of pain. And if Tylenol works, that's terrific. That is, well, I don't understand why in this particular case it would, because Tylenol tends to work on the peripheral nervous system. But if it works, and it's, I don't want to mention placebo, but if it works, that's great.
Yeah, I think so. So not saying that this is placebo, but you do talk about placebo effect a little bit in your book, which is also powerful. I think from a psychosomatic standpoint, we know that when you have feelings of depression or anxiety, that can present with very physical manifestation or exacerbation of any underlying problem or pain syndrome that you would have. So that might be where Tylenol gives a little bit of relief because of that psychosomatic connection where it's leading to some physical manifestations or symptoms, just like if you have a fear of public speaking and you get up to speak, you immediately have to run to the bathroom. That's a very real response. Very real physical response. So I'll leave that there. The next question says, how long is the delay between injury and changing the cells to become hyper?
Okay, that is a phenomenon known as long-term potentiation. I think what the person is asking is that if you have a more severe injury, you have to protect the injury until the injury is healed because you don't want it to be damaged further. And the way that this happens is that the synapse between the first order and second order neuron undergoes what is known as a potentiation. That is, it becomes more sensitized. The way this works in biochemical terms is that the glutamate that is released under normal conditions by a minor injury generates an action potential. But when there's a severe injury, there are many more action potentials that arrive at the presynaptic terminal. Much more glutamate is released. And as a result of that, there is the activation of another receptor in the prosynaptic cell known as the NMDA receptor. And the activation of this receptor results in more calcium coming in, a greater generation of action potentials in the second neuron. So now that synapse has become sensitized, it no longer requires a lot of stimulus from the periphery in order to generate a pain. And that is normally supposed to go away at the healing. When the healing is over, you no longer have to protect it. But in the interim, what has happened is you develop what's known as allodynia. If you gently touch an injured area, you only have to generate a few action potentials. When they get to that synapse and go to the second order neuron, they're going to be amplified. So you're going to get pain from something that normally would not cause pain. Hyperalgesia is a little bit higher level. It's something that would normally cause a little bit of pain, now causes a lot of pain. And that's because of the sensitivity. Again, you're amplifying the signal and it's going to produce more pain than it would under normal conditions. How long that lasts is really dependent on a number of factors. Normally LTP is going to last, hopefully it's going to last until about the healing. It can last for a few days. But people used to think that LTP, if it persists, would be responsible for chronic pain. And that does not seem to be the case. The LTP seems to be diminished. But there's another factor that enters into this, and that is the factor I talked about in the beginning, the one that is produced by severe injury and gets retrogradely transported. It could maintain the LTH for much longer periods of time, perhaps indefinitely. So the interplay between the factor that is transported, the development of LTH, the healing of the wound, all of those things are factors that are determined pretty much by chemical reactions at the first and second order neurons.
Wonderful. The next question says, my father was a pathologist, so I'm intrigued by your approach to pain from this point of view. I wonder if that specialty gave you a new perspective that was not considered previously, and that specialty referring to pathology.
No, I had very little input from pathology. My professorship in pathology came when we merged with the pathology department. So I am by no means an expert in pathology. My cell biology and my anatomy professorships are real. So pathology played a relatively small role. I mean, I was interested in pathology when we dissected bodies and we saw a lot of the different types of injuries that occurred. And looking at damaged nerves, looking at inflamed nerves, indirectly said, you know, kind of triggered in me, well, let's follow this up. Where is this information going to go? And that was one of the impetuses for me to study pain.
Okay. How well do you think pain management can be achieved through using meditation to disrupt the pathways that communicate pain, or is it just redirecting the attention, which I guess is, I'll leave it to you.
Yes, I think that mindfulness training is a redirecting of attention, either willfully or by focusing attention on something else, something external to the body. So the answer is yes, it is a redirection, it is a distraction. Those are the two principal reasons why one would meditate or undergo mindfulness training.
Out of curiosity, there had been studies using imaging and functional MRI to look at areas of activation within the brain in patients with pain. Do you know if similar studies have existed to look at the response to mindfulness using imaging?
Yes, there are a number of studies that have been done using practitioners of mindfulness, and they've shown that by and large, the same pathways that are activated in pain are activated by mindfulness, but there is a depression. There is a reduction in some of the centers that are known to be responsible for pain. But it does not involve the periaqueductal gray. It does not involve the opiate system. The placebo system does activate the opiate system. So that's why a placebo works. You have in the situations with mindfulness, you have activation of other centers in the brain that are involved with cognition. So mindfulness seems to work by making the brain aware that the pain should be distracted to something else, but it's not acting via the opiate system. Nevertheless, it's consistent with the idea that the mindfulness does alleviate pain.
I think of patients who are in comas or medically induced comas, and oftentimes family members are at bedside and asking the question of, do they feel any pain? Especially with all the procedures that are going on, with the idea that consciousness is a part of that pathway. Is there insight about that exact question?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's very, very difficult to answer. There have been a number of studies in Belgium where they did imaging of patients who were in coma states, and they find that the patient is conscious, but probably not aware of pain. I think it's an area that needs to be further explored. My appreciation of what they did is that the person in a coma is not completely unconscious. They are conscious to some extent, but whether they're conscious of pain, I mean, normally if a person's in a coma, you do the Glasgow test and they prick your finger or whatever and see if there's a response. So even in patients that have a very low Glasgow score, they are still conscious. but probably not conscious of pain.
Right.
And I think, I think that pain and consciousness are very, very tightly
Right.
coupled.
Yeah, I just wondered, I mean, we just talked about the role of functional imaging in evaluating these centers that are activated during a pain response. It seems like you could potentially, I don't know if someone's already done it, but image patients who are in a coma, and whether it's ethical or not, but to see if they have similar mapping of that pain response in their brain.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion.
Yeah, so someone asked, could you share insights into genetic differences in pain and how pain is perceived by the brain and the intensity of the pain, assuming that not everyone would perceive the same level given a similar injury or other context? So I guess more so about the genotypic differences.
Well, there are people who are very susceptible to pain, and there are people who are basically, I wouldn't say inured to pain, but they can ignore much more pain than the normal person. I don't know what the genetic basis for that is. I don't know where it resides. There's also culture involved. There are cultures in which pain is something that, oh my God, I'm hurt, get me to the hospital. And there are cultures where severe injuries, oh, don't worry about it, I'll be fine. So, I don't know how culture feeds into this. I don't know how genetics feeds into this, but there certainly are major differences. And sometimes it's very difficult for a doctor to determine by looking at a person how much pain they're in. Stoics will just grin and bear it. And other people who are very susceptible will, really respond. I'm in terrible pain. I'm in terrible pain. So that's about all I can bring to that particular discussion.
Thank you for that insight. We have, I will say quickly, I wonder if it is a spectrum, because we know that it's rare, but there are conditions where people have like congenital inability to perceive pain because of problems or the absence of appropriate sodium channels that are needed to send that pain response, like you were mentioning. So I do wonder if there is a component where some people have more just greater signaling than others of the pain response, completely outside of, if you study people within the same cultures and the same likelihood of expressing pain. If you looked at them, would they have different levels of intensity to the same stimulus?
I'm sure it's a spectrum.
Yeah.
Most things are a spectrum.
Yeah. So someone says, I badly broke my right ankle 11 years ago, which required 3 surgeries. Opiates did nothing to alleviate my pain, so I weaned myself off them rather than increasing the dose as prescribed. Even morphine injected directly into my veins had no effect on the intense pain I was experiencing. My surgeon explained that my mind was not receptive to these interventions, and then we lose the question. But I'm going to guess is, was he correct?
Just read what the clinician said. My mind is not, say that again?
The mind is not receptive to the intervention. So I guess it would be the extreme opposite of placebo.
I'm trying to understand why somebody would say that the mind is not receptive. I mean, if an opiate works or it doesn't work. If it works, it's going to shut down the synapse. If it doesn't work, it means that the information is not going through the synapse, but is being is arising internally. So I'm hoping that this patient did not develop a form of central pain in which it bypasses the somatosensory system and is generated because the brain, certain parts of the brain become spontaneously active. That would explain why it doesn't respond to the opiates, and it explains why a lot of forms of chronic pain do not respond to the opiates, because it's generated by spontaneous activity in the circuits of need from the thalamus to the affective and the cognitive systems. Very, very difficult to treat. But that's, from what I understand, if the opiates do nothing, then it has to be a form of central pain. So.
We have another person that says, I'm trying skin patches that presumably stimulate generation of stem cells, which in turn repair injured body parts. Am I wasting my money?
It depends on what the stem cells are. The stem cells themselves are probably doing nothing more than releasing compounds that are going to be binding to receptors. So the key question is you have to look at what type of stem cells they are and what the expectations are and what is the evidence that those expectations are met in a clinical situation. Okay. I think that that's something that has to be evaluated carefully. There are many different kinds of stem cells. And if you get the wrong kind of stem cells, they can be releasing compounds that are going to make things worse. So the idea that stem cells are going to regenerate damaged tissues, I think has to be looked at very carefully because, again, you need clinical data that this is fact occurring.
Agreed. Someone asked, delta nerve fibers and C nerve fibers both send pain. Is the differentiating difference between these two the magnitude of the electrical stimulus?
The difference between the two is that the A delta fibers are highly myelinated. So they are responsible for the initial response. That signal gets to the brain, gets to the spinal cord very rapidly. It causes the withdrawal of the injured area and goes to the brain. So that's the initial acute perception of the fact that there is pain. The C fibers are not as well myelinated, so their action potentials travel slowly. But when they reach to the central synapse, their response is going to be longer lasting. So they're the ones that are going to allow the pain to persist.
I have a question that says, and you may have touched on this a little bit, what do you think of pain reprocessing therapy, which posits that some chronic pain continues after an injury has healed because the brain has learned a pain signal and it continues that signal even though the injury has healed? There was a recent study about this in JAMA Psychiatry.
Yeah, I think that that's entirely possible. I mean, phantom pain, for example. Phantom pain is a terrible kind of pain because the person is feeling pain in the hand when they don't have a hand. For example, the arm has been severed. And a very interesting study was done out in California where this doctor devised a series of mirrors so that when the person looked at their amputated hand, they saw the intact hand in reverse. And after a while, the brain began to realize, well, the hand or the arm is still there, and the pain disappeared.
Yeah.
So the brain was being tricked. And it was a very clever idea. I think the outcome is that you can trick the brain to change whether or not it's recognizing something as being painful.
So someone asked, ancient medicine is beginning to gain attention in the West. How does your research consider acupuncture or other ancient techniques or herbs and remedies from these older cultures?
Okay. Older cultures have contributed tremendously to the control of pain. Opiates were used for centuries to eliminate pain. This was known in the East and in the West. So where does morphine and all of these derivatives come from? They're extracts, they're chemical extracts and modifications of extracts from opium. Marijuana is another one we're developing. Willow bark. Willow bark was used by American Indians to treat pain. Well, willow bark contains salicylic acid, which Bayer converted to acetylsalicylic acid, which is the #1, local anesthetic in the world. So if there is a culture that relies on a particular plant or something as having a value, the chances are that plant does have value. And then it's up to the scientists to look into that plant and find out exactly what the ingredient is and where does it fit into the scheme of pain. I think there are a lot of compounds out there that are potentially important for monitoring or for alleviating pain that just haven't been discovered yet.
And to follow that up, Wade asked, do you believe that acupuncture is effective for chronic pain?
Acupuncture has been, in a double-blind, very carefully controlled experiment, has proven to be valuable for the treatment of lower back pain. But other than that, I have not seen any evidence that it has effects on anything else. But that you need double-blind studies to make sure this is true. And there's no question that certain forms of lower back pain can be treated by acupuncture. The problem with acupuncture is it's not standardized. You go to one person and they put the needle in a little bit different place than the other. They put it a little bit deeper than the other. Some of them use electrical stimulus. So what you want to do is you want to test it, and I think it should be tested, because if it works for lower back pain, it has potential. But you need to set up experiments that the needles are placed precisely in the same place in every single patient, and then you proceed with the experiment.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions kind of about, I'm going to put in the category of biochemistry, and some of the terms you used earlier. You mentioned glutamate earlier, asks Fred. Is that the same as or related to the preservative MSG that I recall being used in Chinese food when I was a child?
Yeah, monosodium glutamate is just another form of glutamate, but it probably is not going to have any effect on the brain because it can't get into the vesicles. But you know that there are effects of monosodium glutamate. You get Chinese syndrome, Chinese restaurant syndrome. You wake up in the middle of the night and you have all of these you sweats and heart beating. So it does have an effect, but I don't know how it could have an effect on pain.
Similar kind of question, would reduction of salt, again, these are questions about, I think, food intake potentially and the pain response. Would reduction of salt intake reduce the sodium that transmits pain messages, talking about the sodium channels that you mentioned?
No. The intake of sodium is not going to have any effect on the action potential discharge.
Fair enough. So I think to tie in together a point that you mentioned before, where there is some understanding of maybe the gut in terms of the gut microbiome and maybe intake affecting the gut microbiome that can play into your pain response, et cetera, early stages of research. But in terms of the neurotransmitters and chemicals that you were talking about, your oral intake doesn't really affect us.
No, but I think that your mood, the mood is going to be determined by the interaction between your gut biome and the brain. I mean, there are certain foods that are going to activate the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is going to influence mood. So I think that there is that connection, that what you eat is not going to directly affect pain directly, but it can affect the affective system by altering your mood. If you're depressed or if you're anxious, and that could be caused by inputs from the vagus nerve, then pain that you have will be exacerbated.
Okay.
You probably know more about that than I do. It's your involvement.
It is my field, but it's not my talk. So I want to focus. I want the audience to have the opportunity to pick your brain and hear your expertise when it comes to these pathways. Perhaps we'll have a separate gastroenterology follow-up session about this. Someone asked, with regards to, we have a lot of mindfulness interests with this, but with regards to mindfulness or practicing being in the present / aware, it's a process to get to that state of control, i.e., like you mentioned, the brain controlling / training the brain. What about ongoing pain? When an individual is dealing with or going through mental or physical pain, is aware of a sort of a learned helplessness about the issue, what would be the advice or mechanism to battle your realization when you're trying then to practice mindfulness?
Okay, the kind of mindfulness that a practitioner can willfully control the attention from because one part of the brain is influencing the other is very, very difficult to achieve. It takes years of practice. It can be effective, but there's no question that all those practitioners are doing is really distraction. It's just a form of distraction. It's just that they can willfully distract the brain. Most people are not going to be able to get into that state, especially if you're in pain now. Trying to train somebody who's in pain, that I think is going to be very difficult. We go back to attention and distraction. The most effective way to use brain mechanisms to alleviate chronic pain is to shift the attention to something else. Train that person to find something that when they think of that, it's an idea, it's something that's happening in the environment, it's a beautiful sunset, distract them from the pain. Difficult to do, but that is really the best. Now, there was a study that came out of Harvard and I think Stanford, MIT. They actually trained volunteers to regulate the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex. And they found that these people could raise the activity and they could lower the activity. And when they were exposed to a pain paradigm, they could willfully lower the ACC activity and reduce the pain. This also worked in chronic pain patients. It was a small number of patients, I think there were 5 or 6. They were trained by monitoring the level of the ACC activity by imaging. They learned how to control the activity of that center, and they could reduce their pain by reducing the activity, willfully reducing the activity in the ACC. So that that again is very positive because it indicates that this is a center and that it can be controlled willfully, but that it requires a lot of training and a lot of practice. Stick with shifting attention. I think that that's probably right now the best way. If opiates don't work, minimize anxiety, shift attention, distract the patient.
Okay. Another gene and genotype question, which I'm not sure there's a good answer to. Are women physiologically more resistant to pain?
It would appear that way. I mean, they have to give birth, which is one of the most intense forms of pain. So yeah, I think that there are studies that indicate that women are more able to bear pain than men. But I don't know what the basis of that is.
Okay. So we don't know of any like sex differences, whether it's endocrine or anything that would alter the pathway of the pain response.
Exactly. I mean, there are so many ways to alter the pathway. There's cytokines. I mean, there's so many things, so many factors that are involved in this that I don't know how we could even approach that.
Yeah. Okay. Can you please talk about the transition from, this is from Sam, talk about the transition from acute pain to chronic pain, especially in the post-surgical setting? We talked about a little.
Okay, acute pain is over within a few minutes. Okay, you are then in a situation where you are activating the C-type nociceptive neurons, and these are the ones that are going to undergo the LTP and are going to send the signals to the thalamus. So those are the neurons that are really going to be responsible for maintaining the pain and sending the signals to the other parts of the brain that are responsible for the persistence of pain, the recognition of pain. I'm not sure what the question, this precise thing that the questioner wants to know.
Yeah, it sounded like they want to understand better how the body transitions from having just an acute pain response, and rather than that subside entirely, it transitioning into this persistent chronic pain.
Okay, chronic pain is a pathological condition. That means that something has gone awry. It's not normal. It can be due to spontaneous activity of neurons anywhere along the pathway. I mean, for example, you take an inflammation. Okay, inflammatory pain can be very, very long lasting. Fibromyalgia is probably a form of this. Take a situation where during surgery, a sponge has been left on a nerve. Okay, now that sponge is going to attract immunocytes. They're going to release compounds, and it's going to activate the receptors in the nerve, and that pain is going to go up and it's going to be recorded as persistent pain, because as long as that inflammation is there, that pain is going to last. But the pain is going to be perceived as coming from the target of those nerves. So if it was left on the nerve that goes to the fingers, the pain will be perceived from the fingers, but the inflammation is at the midpoint. So inflammatory pain can last for long, long periods of time, and it's sometimes very difficult to diagnose. that is the form of chronic pain that I think we can deal with. We've already talked about central chronic pain, which is a whole different situation.
Okay, we have several questions where people are describing their personal experiences with chronic pain, whether it's in the setting of a surgery or chronic pain syndrome where they've tried medications like opiates without any avail and are just seeking any additional insight that you can offer.
Yeah, I mean, if the opiates don't work, then the situation is more serious, unless they can identify what the source of the pain is. Like, for example, long-term inflammatory pain. It might be, but that should respond to the opiates too, because that's going via the somatosensory system. If you have pain that is lasting for months or years, and nothing that you take alleviates it, the indication is that might be a form of the central pain. And that is the most difficult kind of pain to treat. It's probably not, if it doesn't respond to opiates, I don't know of any other medications that it can respond to, because you're blocking the somatosensory system. That type of pain is the kind of pain that I'm hoping is going to be relieved by the optogenetics and deep brain stimulation. That's why identifying the center in the brain is really, really important. Unfortunately, there's not much I can offer these people. It's just a horrible situation.
Yeah, I think also there were different processes that people described here, but depending on your underlying problem, sometimes the adverse effect of opiates can worsen that problem. And therefore opiates won't be the answer. And then other times you can have, over time, opioid hyperalgesia, where, again, that's not going to be your answer. And either it requires a different type of medication that's outside of that class or family, or it requires something else entirely to address the other aspects that go into pain perception. So that's the kind of the clinical input that I would put there. I have, again, lots of patients with pain problems. From a GI standpoint, opiates usually aren't the answer just because it slows things down, but there are a lot of other things that we can try. Someone is asking if you could comment a little bit about early intervention for pain management. They said, would you talk about the idea that the body remembers pain, usually said in the context of early pain management to avoid creating the memory?
Well, the nervous system is plastic, and the brain is plastic, so that one could argue that if you have constant pain, you're rewiring the brain, making it easier, making that particular pathway dominant. But plasticity is exactly what it says. I mean, it may exist for a while, but if that pathway no longer is used, it will revert to some non-pain state. Now, I don't know how memory of pain, you can have a memory of a painful event that's stored in the amygdala, so that it makes you anticipate pain, the expectation of pain, which will make the pain worse. So that is a form of memory of pain, which is well known. I mean, if you're a child and you get an injection, when you see a needle as an adult, you are going to respond, and you're going to feel more pain from that needle than you would under normal conditions. So traumatic events are retained, the memory of traumatic events are retained in one part of the affective system, the amygdala. But I don't think that the brain has a memory trace. If the pain had disappeared, I don't think it's going to reappear based on reinforcement of a pathway.
Here's an interesting question. So you talked about how pain is probably one of the most important sensations, and it's necessary for survival. Somebody asked, is there any harm done to the brain by attenuating the purpose of the pain feeling system?
Well, I mean, that's actually a good question. You certainly do not want to eliminate all pain. I mean, the idea is to minimize the pain, to reduce chronic pain to a point where it is going to be bearable, and not interfere with the acute pain. But it appears that the acute pain still persists in patients with chronic pain. So they will feel, if they injure themselves, they will immediately feel pain from the site of the injury. So you're not eliminating all sensation of pain. Acute pain remains even in chronic pain situations.
Agreed. I'm going to ask a couple of questions out of curiosity, and then we can get back to a couple of the audience questions. In all of your understanding of the science that's out there, the research that you've done, what do you see as the biggest limitations in the research, or the blind spots or areas that still really need to be addressed?
I think the biggest limitation to this point has been trying to develop drugs that alleviate pain via the somatosensory system. I think we have to start to turn to treating the actual source, the ultimate source of the pain, which is in the brain. I mean, we already discussed many cases in which the somatosensory system is not even involved. Psychological pain, central chronic pain, probably other conditions. So, you know, there's been, the opiates were wonderful, and there's been this tremendous focus on sodium channels. There's an emphasis on looking for molecules that might be unique in the somatosensory system. It's very, very difficult to develop a drug. It's very, very expensive. If you're going to develop a drug, then I would want you to develop a drug that blocks the activity in the center of the pain center in the brain, because that blocks everything. Regardless of where the pain is coming from, the source of the pain, psychological, from an injury, from an inflammation, that will alleviate the pain. And that should be the focus of the tension. And hopefully what we're talking about tonight in my book will promote this kind of activation.
Do you think the science is there yet to really target what we're blocking? Say, for instance, my problem is chronic pain in my knee. If I focus a little bit peripherally, then I won't feel that pain just in my knee. But if I happen to have a bad attack of appendicitis, I'll know about that. But if we're doing treatments that are really focused centrally, do we run the risk of knocking out all of our pain response and then missing some of these key signals about other things going on outside of the chronic pain that we're trying to manage?
No, I think that the acute pain will persist. So you will be aware of an injury. You will feel pain acutely from an injury. You'll know where it is occurring, and the mechanisms to protect it will be in place. I think, well, I'm not quite sure how to address that.
Yeah, because I always wonder, we have patients that we see in the hospital that are post-op and, you know, being managed with opiates, and trying to address for something else. Say they have an acute cholecystitis. One of the tests that we do is to see if they have a certain sign when we press on their right upper quadrant.
Right.
If they're on a ton of narcotics, they might not present in the same way, and it can kind of confound what the physical exam shows. So when I think about addressing pain from the central nervous system, which is an exciting thought, I always wonder, what does that mean for us when we're trying to evaluate other things that might be going on? But I appreciate the point that acute pain and chronic pain would be affected differently.
Right, and the emphasis on, look, chronic pain is one of the most horrible, debilitating conditions that you can have. People who have cancer pain, it's horrible, but they're eventually going to die. Chronic pain patients are they're in pain day after day, month after month, year after year. I think that if we can develop inhibitors that block the activity in the center, the pain center, it's worth it. It's not going to work for everybody. I mean, this is not something that should be done for every time a patient receives surgery. We're going to put electrodes into their brain. But to alleviate chronic pain, I think that this is the way that it's going to go. I don't see the pharmaceutical industries going out of their way to develop specific inhibitors, looking for specific inhibitors. They don't have targets. Mm-hmm. The pharmaceutical company wants a target. And then if they have a target, then they want you to test it. And then if you test it and it looks good, then they say, okay, we'll work with that. But there are studies of the glutamate receptors in the anterior cingulate cortex. the nature of them, how they're connected to other neurons in there. So I think that if you want to focus on a target, let's focus on targets in the pain center, as opposed to focusing on targets in the spinal cord or someplace else.
Yeah.
If you have pain that's mediated by the somatic sensory system, the opiates will block, because they block the transport, or the tricyclic, or the combination of all of these. It'll block it. But if the pain persists despite all of those treatments, then we're going to have to find something that deals with the pain center.
Yeah, so it's going to be either an interesting race or a beautiful marriage of precision medicine trying to target the individuals, and then developing therapies that are, more top down for management of these syndromes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Could you tell us, or tell me and everybody, I guess, listening, what's on the horizon for you?
I'm retired.
I know, but still, what are we doing nowadays? You're still following the field. You just published the book. What's exciting for you that as you're looking forward into the field and learning about it more?
Okay, what I'm very excited about is I'm writing another book.
Okay.
I'm writing a book about consciousness. What is consciousness? How can we approach consciousness? And I think the way to approach consciousness is to understand the consciousness of pain.
Is that what prompted this book, starting
Exactly.
from pain experience?
Right, exactly. I mean, John Locke said, well, there's no one form of consciousness. You have a consciousness of ideas, and you have a consciousness of sensations. But we can't approach the consciousness of ideas because we have no idea where in the brain that exists. But we can approach the consciousness of a sensation by looking at the center from which the sensation arises. And right now, that's the anterior cingulate gyrus. A very famous person in the field of consciousness, David Chalmers, said that there were two problems in trying to resolve what consciousness is. And he said the easy problem is to find out where in the brain the consciousness arises. The hard problem is to find out how what comes out of that center interacts with something that makes us conscious. So we think that we have discovered what the easy problem is. If the anterior cingulate gyrus is a pain center, then our consciousness of pain arises from the activity in that particular center. Now, how that translates into a consciousness, it's a much more difficult problem, and it may involve things that we're not even aware of. But if we can control it, we can shut consciousness of pain on and off, on and off. And what happens to that circuit when you turn it off, when you turn it on? Does something emerge from that? It's unknown. But at least now we're not speculating about, whether rocks are conscious, plants are conscious. We are focusing on an actual place where we know a particular form of consciousness arises and might be able to be manipulated. So it may give us some clues as to what consciousness is. So I'm writing a book about that.
I love it. Sounds like a very interesting topic. I look forward to reading it. I'm going to ask one last question from the audience that puts many, many questions together. And these are more clinical than anything, I think. I will list off the disorders that people have described. And if you have insights about anyone, feel free to jump in. And people really want to get your thoughts about central nervous system disorder, TMJ pain, chronic post-meniscus surgery, knee pain. They want to hear your thoughts about reflex sympathetic dystrophy, complex regional pain syndrome, any chronic migraines. Any thoughts on any of those particular clinical diagnoses?
Again, we can divide pain into two categories: pain that is relieved by the opiates and pain that's not relieved by the opiates. And right now, what we can say is if it's relieved by the opiate, it's going to involve the somatosensory system. If it's not relieved, it's going to involve central processes in the brain. Some of these syndromes that were just described, you just don't really know what the source of the pain is. Complex regional pain the source of it is not clear. Some people think it's an inflammation, and there are different kinds. There's nerve involved and there's inflammatory types that are involved. It's not clear what is generating the pain. But if the opiates don't treat it, do you have any other alternatives besides opiates for your patients? If you know that the pain is coming from a structure that the information is being transported, the information is flowing along the somatosensory nerves?
Yeah, so I primarily is to treat the underlying process. I first would be treating or managing whatever the underlying process is, which a lot of these things are going to be, if the process isn't completely reversible, we can at least do something to that's a little bit more temporizing. I don't prescribe opiates usually for functional abdominal pain, the pain that my GI patients have, because I know that it will slow their transit. They can have adverse effects of nausea, vomiting. There are a lot of GI adverse effects of opiates, narcotic bowel syndrome.
Oh, yeah, constipation.
Yeah, constipation, etc. So I will turn to a lot of different things depending on what the other symptoms are that they have. And sometimes, like I mentioned, it might be a tricyclic antidepressant, SSRI, SNRI. It might be something as easy or as straightforward as an antispasmodic for the gut, right? So if your pain is due to smooth muscle spasms or musculoskeletal issues, there are other type of pain medications that might be even more appropriate than opiates for management of that. I also like to have patients really explore the role that stress is playing on their pain or anxiety is playing on their pain, and can we do more to address that side of it? Because what ends up happening, especially with patients with chronic pain, is if you've suffered from this pain for so long, I say this to patients, if you weren't depressed before, you're probably depressed now.
Exactly.
And even if I can treat whatever is going on within your GI tract, I might not be able to reverse the other aspect of it. And we need co-management to deal with that. So you've described pain perception and pain pathways beautifully. There's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of connectivity, a lot of crosstalk. And because of that, as of right now, it might not be one size fits all for everybody. And there might not be one medication for everybody, and we'd have to try different approaches. So that was
just summarize. I mean, you just hit on the key points.
Yeah.
If you don't know what the cause of the pain is, it's almost impossible to treat because you don't know where to begin. You don't want to start working in the brain. You don't want to do a lot of more damage. You need to know the source of the pain. So these syndromes that are very vague and ill-defined, the key is you need to find out what the source is. Then you need to relieve the things that will make the pain worse. Like you said, you have to reduce anxiety. You have to prevent depression, because all those are going to exacerbate the pain. They're going to make it worse. They're going to make their lives more miserable. Then you go to the drug regimes. You try the opiates. You try other things to see if they relieve the pain. And if they don't, then you can be pretty sure that the pain is due to something that's happening in the brain. And that is going to depend on being able to manipulate the centers in the brain.
So we are running out of time. That was a fantastic talk. I feel like that was a great summary statement by you. I love that we also ended on the note that there's something on the horizon for you with a new book. Maybe there'll be another talk about that when it comes out. Thank you all for those of you who joined us for this talk and those who will watch afterwards on YouTube. Thank you for the wonderful questions that you asked. If you are not already a member of the clubs, we invite you to become a member for more great programming and exclusive events. Thank you again, Professor Ambron, for joining us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very informative. I think it was terrific.
Great.
I enjoyed it very much.
Take care.
When did you graduate from Columbia?
In 2012.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I think I just missed you, yes?
You just missed me. Yep.
Yes, exactly. All right. Have a good night, everyone.